Good evening, brothers and sisters. Welcome to another edition of Everyday Faith. We have an amazing guest today who's going to talk about a very controversial topic of policing and criminal justice. Now, before we go into that, have you ever wondered what faith, spirituality, and even the Bible has to say about this kind of topic? Well, a Bible verse I would like to allude to comes from James 1:17, and that is this: religion that God our Father accepts as pure and faultless is this: to look after orphans and widows in their distress, and to keep oneself from being polluted by the world. And when I read that passage, it reminds me that God looks out for those who are most vulnerable. God looks out for those who are most marginalized. God looks out for those who are the most susceptible to oppression and violence. And so today we are going to talk about this subject with a heavy heart in light of what's been going on. And our guest is uniquely positioned to talk about this, John Tiersma Watson. He is a minister in the inner city. His father was a police officer in Philadelphia. He also lived in Los Angeles during the Rampart Division scandal. So we are going to have a very, very juicy episode. So without further ado, we welcome John Tiersma Watson.
Hello, hello. Good to see you, Eric.
Well,
thank you for your invitation to be here.
Good to see you, John, and thank you. Last time we learned so much. You're just a fountain of wisdom and your knowledge of books, world affairs, and you're like a philosopher to me.
There's always more to learn, Eric.
Modern day, I call you the modern day Confucius and Aristotle.
Well, I would be humbled in there. As long as I'm following Jesus, I'm doing okay. And my favorite prayer is, Lord Jesus Christ, Son of God, have mercy upon us. We all need that undeserved favor. So help is my favorite prayer. Show me, guide me is my second. Asking right now for God's guidance as we enter into this troubled space. You know, I want you to know that in John the Baptist in addressing soldiers before Jesus launches his ministry,
right,
addresses their abuse of power. He encourages the ones that come to him to not abuse their power.
Well, we're gonna get it. We're gonna get into that topic in terms of abuse of power. So that's just like a opening hook. So stay tuned. We're going to get to that. But as a kind of to help people get to know you and to kind of place you personally, socioeconomically, politically, how would you identify yourself? So how would you position yourself with respects to those areas?
Now, it's interesting. I was born in Philadelphia. I lived my first 5 years there. My parents were hopeful during the King era for racial reconciliation. So my mom looks white, but she's part Native American.
Oh, wow.
And my dad is African American with some Cherokee. And in that context, after Martin Luther King got shot and killed, Philadelphia increasingly became unlivable for my mom. The social tensions, the pressures. And so she left and went to Princeton, New Jersey.
Wow.
It's a strange thing to grow up on welfare in Princeton. Not a lot of people know that there's a micro ghetto in Princeton.
Well, actually, I just want to finish the Philadelphia section. Do you have any vivid memories or something of special note while you were in Philadelphia on a personal level?
Yeah, the vivid memories are ones that I actually wouldn't want to repeat. There's subjects of violence and other things, right? my sister was also very much influenced by me. One time I ran into the street, she followed me, she got hit by a bus. She survived,
Wow.
gratefully.
Wow.
Yeah. So
So what
I
I hear is,
was a very active kid and always have been a pretty active soul. So yeah, they wanted, when I was in kindergarten, they wanted to put me on Ritalin, and my mom would not let them. And I'm really glad that didn't happen.
well, I know that's a very common problem, which is teachers and educators wanting to medicate students of color, especially African American students. And because for whatever reason, obviously that could warrant an episode all on its own. But you're glad that you didn't get on it, which I think would have probably stunted your development.
There's a whole thing. There's a whole area in this where our learning style isn't wired for kinetic learners, and kinetic learners are overrepresented in some things. Like they're overrepresented among entrepreneurs because they have to get out and do it. They just can't wait. But they're also overrepresented in great institutions like our prison, because we do something first and then we reflect on it afterwards.
Right. So I think that's the thing, is that a lot of times our educational system is there's an institutional and cultural bias in a sense, right?
Yeah.
So that people who don't fit into that mold of just sitting there listening, watching the teacher as a sage on the stage, if you don't fit into that mold, then you're a troublemaker, and you're
only
therefore
to the system if you're going to make something happen, right?
right.
And in school, we were going to make something happen every day. So,
well, that's the thing, is that kind of connects to the justice issue if you think about it in terms of the school prison pipeline, because at a very young age, right, someone like you be diagnosed as a troublemaker and medicated and maybe suspended, and so that would be be on the fast track towards jail and prison.
So instead of doing that, because my mom wouldn't let them, they put me through some behavior mod stuff to encourage me to read books. Can you believe that? That did me well. So, yeah.
Well, let's talk about moving to Princeton. Let's get to that and how that shaped your kind of personal experience and your view of the world.
So one of the things you need to know about Princeton as a town is it's the northernmost southern town. That is, it's the furthest north a true Southerner can go to school, to college, university, without betraying Southern values. So when Cornel West was at Princeton, and as a professor, the police department had to hand out his photograph and say, "Please stop pulling this guy over. You're embarrassing us. He's a professor at Princeton."
Wow.
Right? So you got pretty well ingrained through stories, through life experience, what spaces were like you had permission to be in, and what places really you weren't.
Right.
There was also a great capacity for the moneyed people to shape reality the way they wanted it. There became a period when I was in Princeton where the Democrats were winning too much of the borough. There was this sort of setup where there was the center of Princeton is the borough, the outskirts was the township, two sort of political entities, and the borough was going too Democratic. And so those with money helped split take housing out of the borough and move it into the township for some of the less moneyed residents so that they could split the black vote. And
wow.
So gerrymandering.
basically a form of gerrymandering, more or less.
Yeah, and yet I want to say that in terms of my friends who were in public housing, that I lived on John Street and wasn't, but there's Clay Street down the road. My friends who we had friendly competitions with and were in public housing, that was some of the best public housing in the East Coast. I mean, being in Princeton had its benefits in terms of access to opportunity and resources that were quite different. Another strange reality I experienced being the preferred Black. I'm not a dark-skinned Black. So that whole dynamic of being the one that got the free YMCA scholarship and my peers not getting those things was not an uncommon reality.
Well, I want to get into, I want to kind of get to how shaped your worldview in terms of your dad, because I want to connect it more directly to criminal justice.
So I want to be clear. One of the things that happened is my mom had to leave Philadelphia because it became too violent. My dad later on joined the Philadelphia police force. We were separated. He then worked to reconcile with me in 8th grade and then began to build a relationship with me. While he was a policeman in Philadelphia, I watched certain realities unfold. In Philadelphia, the housing police were not paid the same as the regular policemen. The city of Philadelphia had actually done something pretty shady. They had hired a whole group of police to manage the housing projects, and basically hired them as security guards and gave them badges. Didn't even give them the same training. Didn't require the same training. So my dad, when he finally realized like he was getting one kind of pay and other policemen were getting a completely different pay scale, they brought that to court. They won that in court, and then they realized. Then the city came back to them after they won, said, "Well, you guys aren't trained as policemen, so we have to fire you."
Wow.
Then they had to fight that and require that the city actually give them the training. Once my dad went through the training that he should have gotten, right, supposedly, then he was, they tried to push him out on an through age discrimination, and he won an age discrimination lawsuit. And this is all while trying to serve and protect. So
now you had talked about how your dad was called kind of the
my dad was
social worker with a gun.
Yes, my dad was definitely known. He was known as Dr. Shock and social worker with a gun. Dr. Shock, because he would shock you with a joke, and you would, if he arrested you, you would be laughing on your way to jail. Yeah, and he was a social worker with a gun. So he would look at the housing projects he was responsible for, and he would get together with his buddies, and they would identify emerging problems and try to figure out how to solve those problems before they became a problem. So, for example, there was this group of guys that were emerging possibly to become a drug dealing clique. And they were hanging out the corner with nothing to do, and they're kind of restless and youthful. And he got together with some of his old military contacts and planned a summer for them that they couldn't refuse.
Wow.
He basically had 6 different families one in Japan, one in England, one in Germany, one in Italy, one in Holland, and I forget where the other one was. And he broke the guys up. He sent each one of them to spend a week or two more, with each family rotating, so that they got to travel Europe over the summer. And they got to be with strong, healthy role model families for a whole summer and see a completely different life. And so when they came back, they spent maybe one more week on the corner, and they were bragging about everything that they saw, and they said, wow, this is amazing, this is beautiful. But when it came down to just hanging out on the corner, that was just too boring. That was too shallow. That they had seen more, and they were hungry for life. Half of them went on to learn another language and move to another country. The other half also went and got their education and actually spread their wings throughout the U.S. and actually lived really significant lives and were role model influencers.
Wow.
In the very neighborhood that they were supposed to be coming up as thugs.
Well, it sounds like your dad kind of had a different model for policing, in which he actually invested in the youth of the community, right? And he broadened their horizons.
Look, at great risk to himself. Do you know, like, if that had gone wrong, like, he wasn't targeting the good kids, right? The ones that everybody, we tend to, when we think of people setting up programs, they're often targeted to reach the youth that already have something going for them. These are the ones who were set up that are going to be the problems, right? And he would go after them and figure out how to change what their day in and day out reality would be. If he could get inside of their head and change what was happening in their head, it changed their lives.
Right. Well, I think that kind of brings up to a kind of a completely different paradigm, in which it's about prevention, right, over intervention. Because
looking at the very young Black men as assets to the future communities that they will contribute to, and investing in them as future assets in those communities. Right. So one of the things is we have a crisis and problem-centric vision of youth and their problems. I have a friend who named Stuart Dowerman, who's Jewish. He said when he was 13 years old, when he had his bar mitzvah, a group of men got around him and said, well, now you're 13 years old. We are going to support you, and we've put this money aside. It was equivalent of what would be today about $10,000.
Right.
And we are going to coach you to start your first business.
Wow.
Right? So at the age of 13, you've got a group of men around you, and you're resourced, and you get to start your first business. He said, none of us rebelled because there was nothing to rebel against. We were trying not to drown us. We were trying to figure out how to make money hand over fist and make it work for us. And it's and so, when I was asking him, just out of wanting to understand what it means to work with youth, why, are you guys in your community doing so well? He's saying, we've had a system within our own community of coaching and mentoring and sharing and responsibility for our young people that's gone on for generations.
Well, that brings up a good point, because right now, and I study this in family systems, is that nowadays, parents are working more and more hours, right?
Yeah.
And the youth are increasingly disconnected from their families because industrialization kind of destroyed the extended family, and now the age information has caused the nuclear family structure to deteriorate. And so what we have is basically a lack of social capital. They're not mentors, adults investing in the youth. And I think this is especially in African American communities, in which, for example, that famous stat that there are more African American men in prison than they are in colleges. So I think if we want to get to the root of the problem, we really have to invest in the youth, like you said, like surround the young men, right, especially the at-risk youth, with adult mentors who, like you said, give them money.
We also taught people to love things through consumerism rather than, so let's not forget the social contract that happened after World War II with business, where basically the business interests that help us win World War II said, we don't want to have to go out of business. And so this contract was made to try to use advertising to convince the American public to buy at the rate of consumption rather than at the rate of need. And so this overconsumption then also demands our time. So we spend a lot of time with our stuff and now even on our devices, right? Rather than in relationship.
Well, I think that's exactly it. And that's even worse when it comes to, for example, impoverished families in which parents are working 2, 3, 4, 5 jobs just to put food on the table. And so again, then the youth are kind of out there on their own trying to figure out how to live life. And, is it really surprising? Now, I want to get to the next issue, and that is the idea of defunding the police. Right, because your father is a police officer who really tried to focus on prevention, focus on investing in the youth, focus on being mentors to the youth. So what would he say, and what would you say? I mean, what are your thoughts on this movement?
The first thing is we want people to hear what kind of police we would like to see defunded, right? If you were in LA, and just even go to Wikipedia and check out the Rampart Police scandal.
And that's where you grew. That's where you lived here. You lived for a while, right?
When I landed in LA, I was working as a missionary and pastor in the West Lake Pico Union community. And so if you can imagine where policing was done in such a way where you're trying to instigate violence. So, I gotten to know some of the homies. I was trying to reach out, trying to see them come to God. And they were telling me stories like, 5-0 pick me up. They were questioning me, but they were also driving me to another neighborhood. And then they made me get out in front of gangsters from that other neighborhood. And that made them think that I'm a snitch. And because of that, now I'm marked for death, man. What do you do when that is your police department? You see, emotionally, if you experience pretty consistent negative experiences in interactions with those with power, then you're going to have a not so happy vision of what they are. But
right. So it kind of all depends. What you're saying is that it all depends on what exactly is your definition of policing, what exactly is your experience of policing. Because again, like you said, if the youth and if the people of color are experiencing the kinds of policing that your father embodied, I have a hunch that they probably would not be calling for defunding the police, right?
Right.
But
so at the heart of the matter is people want people who care and who care for them, right? So there's another problem, which is that both teachers and police are being expected to fill in these voids in the communities that actually they're not in a role to fill in, right? My dad went out of his way. He found people, right? He would find people who, you know, he got together with his friend Father George, who was a street working Orthodox priest, and he would drag Father George into situations that Father George would never have walked into himself. But he's like, you know, this family needs a blessing from you, Father. I mean, it's just like, the thing is, if we don't get people who are genuinely loving, healing presences in places where there's a vacuum of hope, then where's vision for and hope going to come from? Let me say something about Eugene Rivers and tie it back to this.
Right.
There's
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
pastor named Eugene Rivers in Boston.
Mm-hmm.
He got to know some of the folks who were running a local crack house. The way he got to know them was one of the guys running the crack house was being shot at, and he ran through his yard, and while he was being shot at, his house got shot up.
Wow.
So then the guy came back to him and said, apologized and said, man, yeah, they were after me and sorry. And so Father Eugene Rivers, I mean, Pastor Eugene Rivers really wanting to connect with the guy said, look, I'm trying to do a good thing here. I'm trying to run the church, trying to help people actually do good in this community. So why are people like you winning and people like us losing? I mean, you admit that you bring some hardship into our community. I mean, my house got shut up. And he's like, Pastor, you really want to know? It's like, yeah. It's like, Pastor, when little Joey comes to the corner liquor store,
mm-hmm.
and his mom sent him to go buy a loaf of bread, I'm there and you're not. So I win and you lose. I get to mentor him. I see him. I plant seeds of thought and inspiration. I show off my money. I show off my hustle. I get him. And he follows me rather than you.
Right.
And at the essence of some of our core problems is who is mentoring who. If we don't get out there and teach young people a good way to live, somebody with a thugalicious life will come along and teach them a thugalicious way to live and exploit them for their thugalicious life. Right? We're having an interesting problem with people who are not being cared for, now being recruited into sex trafficking, seduced into that kind of madness, right? And that's really at the core. If good people don't step up and mentor, somebody will step into that void. And that is critical. I think that police would think really differently if we could create space for them where 10 hours a week they were actually mentoring from somebody from the neighborhood that they were working in. If we shifted their work and so that they actually had maybe, a mentoring role where they were actually seeing the life from the inside out of somebody they got to know and were responsible for and were contributing to their lives, they would see the world differently. They would work at the world differently. They do their work differently.
Right, and I think that brings up a very important point, which is a paradigm shift is needed, right? Kind of you're saying that, okay, do you see the people in the community, or do you see them, what is your relationship with them? Do you see them as liabilities, as threats, or do you see their potential? do you see them as assets, right? And this is the idea of kind of from a retributive justice model of we got to catch the bad guys, we got to, all right, lock them up, put them away, do the crime, do the time. If we just focus on that, then we've been doing that for years and years, and that hasn't been working. And then what it seems like what you're suggesting is having a restorative model of justice in which you're really nurturing and developing the community.
We can't ignore the larger role when you are in a community and you're handling issues of life and death. You are dealing then with issues of worldview, of issues of the soul, and police suffer tremendously so Eugene Rivers, in wanting to change the dynamic in Boston, came up with a 10-point plan, but part of the process of coming up with that plan was meeting with the Catholic Church, that many of the Irish Catholic policemen who were involved in beating Black men in Boston were under the nurturing care of the Catholic Church. And he was meeting with priests and saying, look, I can get my African-American brothers and sisters to reduce and to stop some of the stealing and thugging they're doing if you can get some of your Catholic police to stop beating us.
Well,
and
that's
actually created an alignment of people who were involved in spiritual care across the boundaries. And that reconciliation actually led to a significant reduction of violence in Boston. One of the things that we have, one of the big problems is right now, we don't have a big or even hopeful vision for actual reconciliation across very tenuous boundaries. Like, how are these relationships going to be rethought, reimagined, and restored? We need the people who are responsible for hope and imagination at that level to step up.
Well, you bring up a good point. And recently, a friend of mine in DC, he's a pastor, and he said that 2 youth came up to him and to confess their sin. And he said, well, what is your sin? And he said, Pastor, we stole some loaves of bread, we stole some food. And my friend asked them, well, they're 16-year-olds, and he asked them, well, why did you do that? Why did you rob somebody so that you can buy a loaf of bread? And they said, well, because we don't have any money. Yeah. And that brings up the question of, what do you think? How do you think a policy like an guaranteed annual income, which Dr. King proposed, or universal basic income, how do you think a policy like that would address poverty? How would that affect poverty and crime?
Let me say that one of the challenges is if there's not some kind of management around rent, because what I would immediately see happening in LA is that money being siphoned off by landlords.
Right.
And then it's basically welfare for the rich again.
Right.
But if we could actually create both housing security and food security, then if you're familiar with what people call Maslow's hierarchy of needs,
right,
people would then have an opportunity to invest in things that were more human rather than just survival. And we know that people who are just surviving tend to make poor decisions about everything.
Well, that's why I said that poverty is not the lack of character. Poverty is the lack of cash. And when you don't have that many good options, you end up making bad choices. And, for example, I know that, obviously we need to have things in place like affordable housing, rent control. But for example, with universal
I
basic
would
income,
I would rather borrow a model from Toehiko Kagawa and the historic cooperatives that he organized. He basically, I mean, businesses rise and fall, but people learn a lot by trying. And if you created a co-op, like anyone who was unemployed could help form a cooperative, get a small grant, and experience the journey of trying to make something work, and be paid in the process. You see, people need this sort of space for inspiration, vision, and potential guidance. They don't, just money itself is corrupting.
Well, here's the thing that
I
you
know
speak
that
about.
I know that basically, people in the same way that people line up to try to get people to sell their food stamps for all sorts of things, right? It doesn't work unless you have to get in the heart and the head and the mind of people to improve their lives. They have to have hope.
Right, and if you think about this, think about the fact
Have a
think about,
confidence and faith to do something.
yeah, you
And
bring up a good point about
relationships that actually love.
right, and you bring up a good point about co-ops, because if you think about, for example, a universal basic income, right? If a church of 200, let's say, for example, a church in the impoverished area, 200 people put together their $1,000, that's $200,000 a month, right? And what could be done with $200,000? You could be buying up apartment buildings. You could be buying up businesses. You could be starting co-ops with that kind of, because if you only look at it from a very individualistic point of view, like, oh, well, what can you do with 1,000? Rent is going to go up. But if you think about the concept of buying back the block, because what can you buy? What's the buying power of $200,000 a month? You can buy commercial buildings. I mean, you can buy apartment buildings, and then people can actually. I mean, that's the problem with rent control, is that as long as you're under rent control, you're always going to be a renter. You're never going to be an owner. But what if you could buy an entire apartment building? A church is saying, you know what? Let's help solve the housing problem. We're going to buy an entire apartment building.
You see, one of the things that is missing in that conversation is about learning flow, right? There's a mentality that billions of dollars are spent every year to nurture, which is money is for spending. There's some folks who develop a middle class mentality where they think, oh, money is for saving, so I can protect the situation that I'm in. I'm cared for. But anyone who's going to get out of poverty knows that they have to learn to make money work for them. They actually have to create streams of revenue, right? And so I think that we need to wrestle with, on a much more fundamental basis, how to help people both be able to do the work that they're qualified to do. How do we help people who are vendors be free to do their vending, but also learn to manage their money in such a way that they can actually not just grow old and die on the streets vending, but actually learn to make the kinds of investments that will actually, change their social location.
Right, and I think that's where, and that's where financial education, financial literacy, right? The thing is, okay, let's say you train somebody to have financial education, financial literacy, and all these things. But that, again, if you don't have,
if you have a government dole, if you're on the government dole, then there has to be some people out there, some kind of training that's around learning how to leverage that resource for both their individual good, their family good, and their community good. And it needs to be a regular, at least twice a month conversation. You're getting paid this $1,000. You've got to be at these conversations. You need to be part of it. If you don't have any input, right, people are just like,
yeah, because right. So I think it's two pieces, because if you have money without the financial education and literacy, then you can just, a lot of, like, for example, many professional athletes, they just, lose it all, right? Yeah. And consumerism. But on the other hand, you could be financially literate and have all the financial education in the world, but if you don't have money, you can't really do anything. So, somebody could be very educated and, they're like, okay, I want to start a business. For example, I have a friend, he's in prison right now, and he wants to start a business, right? So he wants to start a fitness company and all that. But again, if you exit from prison and you have no money, how do you start a business? You can't, right? So
is he really good at exercise?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Do you know when he's getting out, roughly?
A couple of years.
Okay. I'd like to meet him. Maybe get me his address. I'll drop him a note, but it'd be interesting to meet him. The thing that would be interesting would be to see if he could create, the first thing is to have him land with some initial contacts where he can buy and sell weights, if nothing else. And
right, but I mean, that's what I'm saying, is that, again, if we really want to, keep people out of the prison industrial complex, right? I mean, let's say somebody like him.
Yeah.
To kind of have a new way of life, you need to have some level of capital. You can't just go out and say, okay, well, I'm just going to start a new business. It's not that.
If you have the mindset, you can actually learn to start hustling with about $100.
You still need $100, because where are you going to get the $100 from? They don't even give you $100.
Yeah.
Now,
the thing that's critical, I found, is $100 and accountability. Are you familiar with the classic business book called The Richest Man in Babylon?
Yes. Now, I do want to have that conversation, but I think
we'll have that conversation another time. But I want to say that here's the bigger picture. The police are often in our neighborhoods, not there to serve the people, but to protect property.
Protect wealth, to protect wealth, yes.
And the problem is, as long as people know that, hey, you don't care about me, then that attitude gets mirrored back. Then why should I care about you, right? So if police want to have a genuine investment in their neighborhood, they actually need, the neighborhood in which they are being policed, then they actually need to show that they're actually invested in the welfare of the communities they're working in. So I think that if people, there's all sorts of indications. Teachers and police that don't want to live in the neighborhoods where they work, that says that there's a problem. Can you then make the problem go away by telling them you must move into these ghetto neighborhoods? No, because then you don't necessarily get the quality people that you want to do your policing. But it means that you need to have people who have vision to go in and actually begin to unpack the problem from the grassroots up. And part of it is being on the ground. I mentioned before the work of a man named John Perkins. He would talk about relocating into communities of need, actually doing the long work of reconciliation, and then helping with the redistribution of resources, the primary resource that each of us have is our lives. And so it's our relational time. And so again, if we want a context to improve, we have to put our love there. That's the hard part, right? Is everybody wants a neighborhood to be better, but it's like, hey, then put your love there.
Well, that's a great place for us to end, because again, it's very easy for people to talk about justice, to talk about the good game, but what about you? What is the sacrifice? People want to do all this justice work, and they're going to live in their beautiful house on the mountaintop. They're going to live in their gated community. They're never going to put themselves in a situation in which they're susceptible to the same dangers, to the same threats, to the same violence that the people that they're invested in are experiencing. So how can you truly know what it's like when you live in a gated community, when you live on a mountain, when you live, in a city upon a hill, right? And
Cornel West said that justice is what love looks like in the public sphere. And we sometimes get it, like, we have a landlord that's not caring for a building, who's a slumlord, and he's just trying to get money out of the building, but he's not investing in the people that live in his building. And there have been situations where slumlords have been forced to move into their own building. Like, you're going to make everybody else live like this. Why don't you live there too? That again is trying to force this issue of, you can't just be owning property and not be invested in what's happening in the community where you own property.
Well, thank you so much for your time, John. I know you have so much. You're just a fountain of wisdom, and I know we can have another segment on a lot of different things, other subjects. So this is part two. This is part two, and I'm sure there'll be a part 3. So I want to thank you for that. And justice is what love looks like in the public square. What a beautiful quote. So thank you so much for your time, John.
Thank you, Cornel West, for that, right?
All right. Brother. Okay. Thank you. All right.
Hey.
God bless. So final thought here. And we kind of saw the lens of justice through a myriad of perspectives, from coming from a marginalized community, from the lens of policing, from the lens of a missionary, urban minister. And I think the final thought we have here is that a lot of times we like to extend charity, right? We want to give and donate and help. And all those are positive things. But true justice makes charity unnecessary. When you get at the root of the problem, when you start investing in the youth, when you start becoming mentors, when you see the people in the community as assets, not liabilities, when you invest in the community, not just own property, but when you live in the community, when you're a part of the community, when you invest your life, your time, your money, your resources in the community, that's when true change happens. Thank you very much, brothers and sisters. Have a good night. God bless.